I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. We've been hammering on education and climate change news for a few weeks now, and well, it's time for a different perspective. For this week's episode, I talked with Caitlynn Peetz, education reporter for Bethesda Beat, the only reporter in Montgomery County focused full-time on education. And she reframes the frustration many parents and teachers in Montgomery County feel. I also talked to Tom Deyo, president of the Montgomery County Green Bank, a county-chartered nonprofit that uses public funds to leverage private investment in green projects, and has announced its first big project, a 275-kilowatt solar generation project sited on top of a bunch of buildings owned by the Housing Opportunities Commission, often called by its acronym HOC.
You know how much you got my heart racing. I haven't felt this in a long time. Do you know how much you got my head spinning?
If you are new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities.
I had figured you out. You find a way to confuse me.
Music for this episode comes from Sic Em Buster, a Washington area rock metal band. We use their song I've Got Athlete's Foot and I'm Wearing Your Socks. Chris Burkaw on vocals, Joseph Nguyen, and Anshul Bhatia on the guitars.
I'm just so tired of trying to make sense of everything that you say.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. We were going to skip schools news this week since Montgomery County's only full-time education reporter, Caitlynn Peetz, is my guest for this episode. But this week, Pat O'Neill, the longest-serving member of the Montgomery County Board of Education, died suddenly at the age of 71. Many local politicians and publications have written obituaries. I knew Pat as the Board of Education member who responded to emails and calls more promptly than others. A few years ago, when Montgomery County Public Schools threw up obstacles to a mental health conference I was organizing, Pat came to the rescue first and helped the conference move forward. When I decided to run for the school board in December 2019, Pat asked me to breakfast at IHOP. I didn't always agree with Pat, and she knew that well. Yet, amazingly, she persisted in her mentoring. Pat O'Neill served almost 24 years on Montgomery County Board of Education and left a big mark of her service on the school district. In non-education news, we have this one inside scoop about Montgomery County Police Department, and it might seem arcane, but bear with me. Montgomery County Police Department recently changed its policy on releasing the names of those involved in fatal crashes. In the past, MCPD used to release the name, age, and approximate addresses of those involved in collisions that caused death. But now MCPD is asking activists and others to email the department for this information. The decision comes from the department's new public information officer, Shira Goff, who in a Twitter message to a local advocacy organization, Action Committee for Transit, provided this justification. Out of respect for the victims' families, we choose to wait 24 hours before releasing the names of any victims involved in a traffic fatality. Next of kin may be notified the night of, however, a significant other or sibling is not next of kin, and we would like to allow time for all to be notified and not read it on social media. If the names were released within 24 hours, it would be all right. But the last name release based on the old policy appears to have been on July 22nd, 2021. There were no names released thereafter for 7 weeks, but 2 people died on county roads last week. And when their names were not released within 24 hours, local activists began asking what was going on. The push led to the release of the names, but it is unclear if the police department has quietly abandoned the new policy or will continue with it. My email to Shira Goff asking about this remained unanswered as of Thursday morning. The policy has several legal and public policy consequences that must be balanced with the idea of victims' rights that is being pushed by the police department. First, Goff's decision expands the definition of next of kin. It is unclear whether this definition change is an administrative or legislative matter. Second, there is a matter of privacy rights of dead people, which are generally believed not to exist beyond matters of property. Third, the change seeks to protect victims' families in one particular way, but not in another. Families may very well want to memorialize a lost relative and make public policy demands based on it, especially if they died in a car crash. Since the effectiveness of policy demands often depends on timeliness and the existence of a public record, any delay in releasing the names and other information could very well delay or obviate newspaper and media coverage of the crash. For example, Washington Post reporting of the 2 road deaths last week did not mention the names, and the Post is unlikely now to go back to report the names when released later. Fourth, beyond the family, society as a whole has an interest in preventing future traffic deaths by learning about the specifics of each crash and publicly memorializing the dead. It is also important to note that the police department in the past released names of those who were involved in traffic fatalities, not just the victim. The release of the names of drivers of vehicles, for example, enabled pedestrian safety advocates to search driving records of those involved and to bring public pressure on the police and transportation departments to improve their procedures and practices. So there is strong public interest in the names being released. Here is local activist Bridget Howe.
The problem with this change in MCPD public information policy is twofold. First, it's bizarre that public information that has been shared for years is now being withheld without an announced policy change. Who made that decision and what was the justification? But second, this means that there's much less public accountability about traffic violence. Sharing the names of victims and drivers personalizes the victims to residents. It allows a glimpse into the demographics of the victims and the circumstances of crashes, and it helps advocates connect with families. I sincerely hope this decision is revisited and we return to the previous transparent policy.
All of this pushback started with the deaths of 2 people on Montgomery County roads last week. A 52-year-old pedestrian was killed on Wears Mill Road, and a 28-year-old motorcycle rider died in Durwood. The pedestrian's name was Nui Nui Ni. The motorcycle rider was Jeffrey Chatterjee. Let me say their names again. Nui Nui Ni and Jeffrey Chatterjee. If you can, please say aloud those names. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. This week we have 2 interviews. The first is with Caitlynn Peetz of Bethesda Beat, Montgomery County's only full-time education reporter, and really I think the most independent voice in education in the county. And I say this because all of us, including me, are partisans in the school system as parents, teachers, administrators, and local leaders. You will hear a knocking sound behind Caitlynn at times, and it is her beautiful and feisty dog, Cece, chewing on her bone. The podcast world often revolves around pristine audio, but it is wonderful, really, to have Cece on the show together with Caitlynn. I'll be back with the 2 of them. Caitlynn Peetz, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So can you give us the latest on what the quarantine and testing policies of MCPS have been?
Yeah, well, the good news is we have news on that as of like an hour ago. So your timing is really perfect. During the meeting with the county council today, MCPS folks said that they're going to change those quarantine guidelines effective immediately to no longer require that the unvaccinated students who are determined to be close contacts of someone who's symptomatic to quarantine while they wait for test results. So basically they're reverting to aligning with the CDC and state guidance that says close contacts don't need to quarantine unless there is a positive test or a known exposure of the person who's symptomatic.
Okay. Are there any differences between elementary and secondary schools? Because I make that distinction because elementary school kids are not yet vaccinated.
I mean, I don't think that it's specifically different in terms of elementary or secondary. I think the distinction is if you're vaccinated or if you're not, which implies that it would be more heavily important for the elementary school kids when we're talking about the strictness of these policies.
Where is MCPS on the other hot button issue of outdoor lunch? Outdoor lunch has been a big issue. So where is MCPS at now?
Yeah, so that is the big thing, right? I mean, the most recent guidance that I had heard from MCPS was that they expect every school to incorporate outdoor meals in some capacity. When kids are eating, have a rotation of who's outside and who's inside, but to utilize the outdoor space as much as you can. However, I mean, I have heard consistently from parents and families and teachers who are on the ground in these schools saying, my school is not doing this as well as I would hope that they would be. We're not utilizing the space in the ways that I think that we could. So I think that there's still a lot of probably working out the kinks in the implementation, but the official guidance is that schools are supposed to be utilizing that outdoor space to the extent possible. During this meeting today with the county council, I mean, there was a question about the outdoor lunch situation, and Dr. McKnight did say, it's going to look different because every school has different, strengths and spaces and things that they can use. So I guess I don't know exactly what they're pushing for the standard to be, aside from saying, we want you to use your outdoor space because it's important.
Yeah, so, like so many other things that in particular, this issue, there seems to be this, a central office directive and an inability on the part of schools to follow through on that directive for reasons that are, it's unclear whether it's a central office problem or a BOE problem or a, school-related problem. I mean, it seems like so many other things in MCPS, this is, hanging in the middle somewhere. What is your sense of where sort of it is, our principals, you think, wanting to do it, but I get a sense that principals have really perverse incentives, right? Because, they are not held responsible if a kid has COVID. But if they have outdoor lunch and a kid walks out.
From my vantage point, I don't think that it's been for a lack of wanting to do it. I mean, I think where there's discrepancies and confusion is when you're seeing maybe communication that hasn't been as clear. When you have a school district that's so big, 209 schools, you have so many moving parts. And I think that where things are falling through the cracks, people aren't necessarily sure what they are supposed to be doing or what they're expected to be doing. And so when you don't know, you gravitate toward what you're familiar with.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because if you're saying that the reason why this communication gap occurs is because there are 209 schools, is MCPS too big?
There are people who would say so. I mean, I don't know. I'm from a little place, so I have very different ideas of what school districts are like. But I mean, I think that at some point you have to look at your communication style and how you're communicating with folks, and if analyze if it's working or if it's not, and talk to them about what they need. I think where sometimes MCPS falls flat in some of their outreaches is seeking the feedback about how to do better moving forward. You see that over and over.
Underlying what you're saying is that for the size that MCPS has, it doesn't have appropriate communication structure in place to be able to effectively communicate what central office wants and needs with its 209 units. I mean, that's what I take away from that.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think that where I sit, as a reporter, I hear a lot when people are frustrated and when they're upset. And I know there are people who think that things are done well the way that they are, right? So it's like, I think you kind of have to also take that into account. But I do think, like I said, there are some people who think that what is being done as far as communication isn't super effective, especially in this very strange and unique time of COVID when, you can't do things the way that you're used to, and you kind of are innovating and communicating in different ways.
What is the situation with bus drivers? Is there a shortage of other staff as well? I've heard that, but I want to get your sense of it.
Yeah, so there's definitely the bus driver shortage. I mean, I'm still today getting emails from folks, explaining their kids' school situation, drop off, pickup is chaotic and they're not getting home on the bus, in a decent time. But, as far as other staff goes, I'm not super familiar, aside from, again, hearing today that I think they said during this council briefing that there's 40 unfilled health tech or nurse positions, which is significant when you're talking about operating a school system in a pandemic, when you are already short-staffed in your health department stuff. And I guess technically those are DHHS employees. However, they are functioning in schools. So I think that is very significant and worth watching moving forward. I've
also heard that MCPS, and maybe you reported this as well, that MCPS is now directly hiring contact tracers. That DHHS used to have the contact tracers, but I think they let them go over the spring. And so now they don't have very many. I think they're down to maybe 20 or 30. Do you know what's going on with there?
So I can't speak to the DHHS side specifically, but I mean, and as far as what MCPS is doing in hiring contact tracers, I was told last week that they're going to hire 10 contact tracers who would be responsible for helping all of the schools, which is, better than nothing, but you still have administrators and principals who are, sitting there saying, we're spending a significant amount of our days conducting this contact tracing and notifications and such. Dr. McKnight yesterday told me as part of the updated COVID plan, her 5-point plan, that, they're surveying administrators to see what they need is in terms of helping on that front. Didn't really have a clear answer as of yesterday what exactly else that would include. But I mean, as far as I know, they're looking to hire very soon 10 contact tracers who would be trained through Johns Hopkins.
Do you have a sense of how DHHS and MCPS divided up the pandemic response workload essentially, and now that there's a shift in that is evolving?
Yeah, this one I don't have a great answer. I wish that I did. It's just like everyone's so cagey as far as like who is supposed to be doing what, and especially when there's like a failure in something.
What are you hearing about the virtual academy? Are there numbers available? I have some unofficial numbers, but maybe you have better ones.
Yeah, so, you have roughly 3,000 students enrolled in that virtual academy. And the last data that I had said about 15% of those students are white. And then you'd have like a higher percentage of Black and Hispanic students, which really aligns with what you see nationally in these virtual academies, where you're seeing, white students and their families returning to schools at a higher rate. But still, when you're talking, you're talking about 3,000 students. So, I wish that I've been able, I asked for the data in broken down by where these applicants and enrollees live as far as zip code, to kind of look at what the COVID situation in those communities have been, but I haven't been able to get that piece of it.
So we hear a lot from parents. We hear a lot from the central office. I want to ask you what you're hearing from students and what you're hearing from staff.
I think for as much as we hear frustrations and concerns and worries from folks, I think, there is some of that, obviously, within the schools, right? But the vast majority of the students, specifically that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to a lot of them very consistently, is just this like relief of having some sense of normalcy back. I've heard a lot of kids saying, my friends and everybody that I'm around is, wearing their masks and doing what they need to do. And even in the elementary schools, I think that to some degree you're seeing then some maybe frustration from the teacher side, because they're tasked with doing so much in general. And then also, with this quarantine problem that we'd been having during their planning periods, they were supposed to be filling in with teaching the kids who are in quarantine. So you're seeing like some frustration with that, but hopefully we'll see that kind of like settle down a little bit now that we have the new guidance, and hopefully see fewer kids pushed into quarantine unnecessarily. I think that the school resource officer issue is still like front of mind for a lot of students, and seeing how this new community engagement officer program is implemented and looks in practice. We need to pay attention to that because it matters to the students, whether they support SROs or whether they do not. Either way, it's important. And then the other big thing that I've heard a lot from students about is environmental sustainability and what to do moving forward with that. So you'll see, I think we'll see a lot more advocacy about that kind of stuff moving forward this year too.
What do you hear from teachers and staff?
Teachers that I've heard are overwhelmingly excited to be back in schools and to like have that face-to-face interaction with the kids. I think everybody's worried about COVID and, transmission and what that looks like. But I think because we have high vaccination rates and, compliance with mask requirements and such, that's not maybe as bad as you'd be seeing in some of these places in the South and other places that, aren't as COVID conscious as we're trying to be, right? So, I think that the vibes are generally good. I think where frustrations come from, conflicting guidance and inconsistent communication from the central office folks. So, like we were talking about before, I think that moving forward, focus on that will be important, and kind of rebuilding those relationships with your employees who, for a while, early on in the pandemic, felt like they weren't being listened to.
You've been reporting on MCPS throughout the pandemic. Do you see MCPS sort of being proactive? Are they much more reactive? How do they operate? Sometimes it does seem like they're flying the plane while, building it.
Yeah, they'll even say that. That's kind of their catchphrase. But I think we have to remember MCPS in the context of the entire country, right? Like there are so many school districts that, aren't doing much at all. Where I think people get frustrated, we have so many engaged, smart folks who have kids here and are just part of this community in general, and see other districts doing things that they feel are really good in MCPS, kind of not ever being the first to do it, but watching, other folks do it and then jump in. I think in some respects, there has been a reactive approach to some things. Even just today, when we're talking about the quarantine guidelines and the testing protocol, not having rapid tests available on the first day of school, the way that Dr. McKnight answered the question as to why, when asked by the council today, was, we were in a good place in June when we got the guidance about testing, and then it changed and we had to change our mind, and I don't know if it's what she meant, but it implied that they felt they didn't need it, so they didn't get it. And so that to me feels reactive. Why not as Council Member Hucker said today, Council President Hucker said, why not just be prepared to have that? But I mean, I think on the flip side, you're also seeing, this staff vaccination requirement. That's not like super common, in school districts across the country. Neither necessarily is the vaccination requirement for student athletes. I think where we're at, like it feels like we're kind of on the tail end of some of that stuff. But in the big picture of implementing some of those things, MCPS is not necessarily like, at the back end of things.
I'm wondering, do you have a sense of how MCPS has organized its COVID response? I mean, do they have teams? How do they operate? What is their structure? What is the structure within which they operate, make these kinds of decisions?
So with the transition of Dr. Smith leaving and then pulling Dr. McKnight up into the interim superintendent role, I think that there was a lot of shift in how they were managing and approaching who's in charge. I know that they have a woman, her last name is Duplinsky, who's kind of like the point person. When I ask questions about COVID response, I'm usually directed to her. So she seems like a point person, and then there's Dr. McKnight, et cetera. But I think that that's, this new administrator that they are planning to hire to be their health liaison, I think is intended to fill this maybe gap that you're implying that might exist in who is responsible for a lot of this stuff. I think that maybe that's the goal, is to have a point person to organize all of these groups and teams and advisory committees that they have.
So the implication of that would be that they haven't had a point person for this long.
I mean, I think that they have point people, but not people necessarily with the necessary health background to be like analyzing and implementing certain things, I think is the point.
What would you say to parents who are upset about various things, about how to put that in perspective for them? I mean, how to put those frustrations in perspective?
I mean, I think it's important to just like validate first that any frustration that you're having at this point is understandable to some degree, whether, you agree or disagree with what's happening. This is kind of a crazy time with a lot going on, and there's not really a perfect answer to everything. And you kind of have to come from that perspective in general. And I mean, I think it's also okay and to advocate for what you feel is right and to keep doing that until you feel like you're listened to individually or as a group. And I think but as far as like perspective, I think again, it comes down to what we were talking about before, where MCPS is a good school district. You see that in a lot of ways, like, when you compare to others, it's not perfect, and it is good that we have that engaged, smart community that is constantly pushing for it to be better. Because even if it's good, even if it's great, it's never going to be perfect, and there are going to be people with ideas and perspectives that make it better.
Thank you, Caitlynn.
Yeah, thanks, Sunil.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. In just a minute, I'll be back with my second guest for this episode, Tom Deyo, president of the Montgomery County Green Bank. But first, a voice letter from listener Ben Bradley.
Hi, Sunil. I just wanted to raise an issue I had about your interview with Maryland Comptroller candidate Brooke Lerman. While I support her policies about using the state's procurement power to support local minority-owned businesses, I thought it was disappointing that Maryland Correctional Enterprises didn't come up in the conversation. Not only is MCE an unethical prison labor system, but it's a system that the state prioritizes in procurement. There are 3 different preferred providers in the state procurement policy, and the top one is MCE. So if we want to look at reforming procurement to support these local businesses, we'll also need to reform MCE, and I think that's something that needs to come up in this conversation. So thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Ben. We'll do better next time. We love to hear from you, and we don't care too much about audio quality. You can record on your phone and email it to ihppod@gmail.com.
You find a way to confuse me. It's always a game, and I'm playing blind. You're always one step ahead. Don't you tell me what you're thinking. Why do you always have to leave me here hanging off a cliff? I'm just so tired of trying to make sense of everything that you.
Tom Deyo, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
The Montgomery County Green Bank was established by a county resolution. What is the Green Bank?
So Montgomery County Green Bank, we're a nonprofit, 501c3, even though we were created by the county. We're independent of the county. We've got an 11-member board of directors, and our job is to bring more capital into the Montgomery County market to invest in clean energy. We were given $18 million of capital from the Montgomery County. That was actually proceeds from the settlement between Exelon and Pepco. We were provided that resource in order to use it to partner with other financial institutions and leverage basically their money into clean energy.
You completed your first community solar deal recently.
Yeah, so it's a 273 kilowatt solar installation. And just to sort of step back, what is community solar?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so you have to think about community solar as like this power plant that sits out there that a solar developer brings to bear, brings it online. And then wherever they bring it online, the solar capacity, they subscribe out to the marketplace in small increments of that. In the one we're doing, it's about 3 kilowatt increments, but they subscribe to homeowners, they subscribe to renters. So those parties subscribe to the developer for a certain amount of generation from that solar array. They pay a subscription, and then on their utility bill, they see a credit from the utility company for the amount of solar generation that was done by that array. So basically, you're investing in a power plant through subscriptions, and you're seeing the benefit on your utility bill for that subscription. So wherever the solar developer puts that array is irrelevant. What matters is that what market you're in, you participate in that solar array. So in this instance, the solar array that was built on the roofs of Paddington Square Apartments, which is an apartment property owned by the Housing Opportunities Commission. They installed 273 kW array on that property, and now the property basically leased that roof to them for $1 because they felt it was a mission-oriented development, which it is. The subscribers can be in the county, anywhere in the county that anyone has a Pepco bill, can subscribe to it. But we instituted a couple extra criteria to this. One, 30% of those subscriptions, so that 273 kW array has 91 subscriptions, 28 of them, or 30%, are only available to low and moderate income earning families. So they have to meet the qualification of that. And those actually don't pay a subscription. They actually get the subscription for free, and they get but they get the benefits on their utility bill. They'll see that $500 credit. That's a structure we put here. We're going to see whether we can, how more we can replicate that. But it's a strong sort of get out the box type of development. And there's the market rate subscribers, pay full fare, and there's a little bit of support there for the low moderate income in that structure. But and then 10 of those subscriptions actually available for people right there on the property. That was one of the things that we also instituted. It's not always the case, but on this particular one, we wanted the property tenants to have some benefit as well.
So who's organizing this? How is this deal organized? Is it a private company that is sort of leading it, or is there some kind of cooperative or something?
Yeah, so many partners put this together, right? Ourselves, we worked with a nonprofit called Groundswell, we got together and we said, okay, we want to put a community solar project in Montgomery County. Groundswell is a community solar developer and subscription manager. And we partnered and we looked around for property opportunities. We saw that the Housing Opportunities Commission had a particular property that was in the Silver Spring area. We approached them. They said, sounds like a great mission-oriented idea to donate our roofs to this project. And so we went about the exercise of figuring out what size project could be on there, and did all the pre-development work of, sizing it, understanding the relationship with the Housing Opportunities Commission, what those subscriptions could be, and then bringing in a solar developer who's Sunlight General Capital, who would actually be the owner, developer, and financier. They bring the equity. The Green Bank not only provided that upfront sort of energy to get this project going, we also become the investor in the project by bringing our low-cost debt capital into the project. So Sunlight General Capital brings equity. We brought the low-cost debt. That combined allowed for that low moderate income component of this project to happen. Groundswell stays on in managing the subscriptions. Sunlight General Capital then hired the actual specific installer, which is Suncatch Energy, who will actually build the array and then partner with Sunlight General Capital in terms of maintaining it. But ultimately, Sunlight General Capital is the owner of the array. They're the ones who sort of maintain it, who those subscriptions flow through to. We now, sort of after having instituted the project, fall to the back in terms of just being now some of the investment in the project.
What is the size of the financial size of the project? How much money did you put in? How much money did Sunlight General put in?
Yeah, so the project itself is about $850,000 in terms of its development cost, and we're about 50% of the capital in there. So about $450,000 or so of capital we'll put in, and then they bring in the other capital through their own equity, and then a tax credit equity partner for a portion of the project as well.
What is the debt? What is the interest rate?
That's a confidential matter between ourselves and the capital provider. But I'll say it's less than what the market would be putting into the.
If you had to actually pay for the rent or the roof rent, what would that do to the viability of the project?
A lot of times when you see third-party solar developers putting it on roofs, there's a lease payment that goes between the solar developer and the property owner, right? Because locations for solar are not always readily available. So you look for where you can. Rooftops in Montgomery County are one of them. So, it could have been a $5,000 or $6,000 lease payment. That adds a cost to the project, which then gets borne by the subscribers, which then creates if we're trying to bring equity to the project, which we're doing, of low moderate income subscribers, that kind of a lease payment would impact the economics and impact the ability to deliver that level of equity.
I'm wondering how replicable this project is.
Well, it's very replicable. I think,
how many property owners are going to give you free roof space?
I think that's a conversation that we're willing to have with the property owners. I think many of them some of them are, particularly if they're looking at this as community solar. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking about it as a solar installation specific to that property, that's a different story. But here, community solar, and our approach to it being an equitable community solar, in that each project that we want to invest in brings a component of it which is offered to low moderate income households. If we're bringing something concessionary to the table, we're looking for their community mindedness to bring a similar concessionary mindedness to it in order to allow for that equitable treatment and delivery of a project. I would say that they get the reputational and branding benefits off of doing that they might not normally if it was just a sort of market rate type of project. So I think what we would look to is for those to sort of look at this as saying, I'm in the community of the community. Here's a project that we can bring on that not only, right now I'm not getting anything off my roof. right? It's sitting there, it's making no money for me. If I can offer this on top of my roof and turn it into an opportunity that the community and certain residents in my community can benefit, that's what we would hope that they would see.
To your best knowledge, did the roof need to be prepared in any special way in order to accept the arrays?
Yeah, so the whole part of the process goes through an evaluation of the roof's ability to hold the solar array, sustain the weight, and the condition of the roof to be available, to be around for the period that the solar array will be around. So all those evaluations are done at the front end. The roof condition is something that has to be considered as you approach these, right? Roofs that get themselves that are 10 years plus years old, you begin to worry about their ability to be around for the full 20 years. So you have to begin to think about, okay, how does the roof condition and the solar array fit? You know, we're looking at projects in which we're thinking, okay, can we build that roof replacement into the solar?
That's
array
right.
itself?
That's exactly what I was asking.
So that you kind of capture that as an expense of the project. Now, smaller projects, it's very hard to do that on, you know, but if you can get up to, 350, 500 kW, you can begin to build that in because you got enough solar production to be able to capture it. If they're too small, it becomes a little bit difficult because the production isn't enough.
What were the challenges that you faced in putting this deal together?
So when you're the first on anything, you face a lot of challenges. And this was the first community solar project in Montgomery County. And so, we had to blaze a lot of new trails in terms of getting a project approved. First part was, finding partners who were willing to sort of put this together, right? So, we had this idea, groundswell in ourselves. We went out and we had to, talk to the Housing Opportunities Commission. There was sort of what is community solar, right? This was a brand new idea a couple of years ago when we started it. So orienting people to what this is, how does it work? How does it function? What happens to my roof? The questions you're asking, all those sorts of things have to be answered at the front end for any, as it's a new idea. And then solar's understood, community solar's not. And so we had to explain what community solar was. So there's a whole lot of sort of front end education. Then there's the activity of sort of going through and figuring out what the capacity was. And we ran into problems. Okay, which of the roofs could be used? And then you have to look at the trees. Oh, some of the trees were impacting roof capacity. And so at what number can you get to in order to make the project work? And how do we get to the right number and get to the right strategy? So structural and the economics had to be figured out. And then once that was figured out, then having to work with the utility and work on the connections with the utility in a new concept for them too, right? So community solar is a pilot within the Maryland marketplace, and so this was the first one in Pepco, Maryland. So we had to sort of work that through, and then getting on the Pepco waiting list for it. And so, how does it work through the sort of Public Service Commission's pilot program? What does that need to be? And then, all right, how are the subscriptions going to work? And how are we going to play these out between the low, moderate, and the market and those on the property? So we had to figure out the game strategy for that. And then the last one is working through the county and county approvals. Again, first in with a new project, getting the county folks familiar with what you're trying to do. This is something new and and not gone through the past. And so we had to work through that sort of effort with them to get them familiar. So now we've blazed all of that, and the next ones will have a much easier path through. Frankly, the financing part of it was probably the easiest part because it's kind of real estate financing. It's a pretty straightforward kind of thinking, but how all the pieces had to come together did have to be worked out, and how we were going to play in there with the equity and how our capital would be of benefit and how that could play through to the bottom line had to be worked out as well.
I would imagine most county-owned buildings would be ripe for this kind of thing. Would you say yes, or do you think that's not?
It's certainly a marketplace we're looking at, right? But you have to sort of look at each of the buildings from a visual from the top. And a lot of times on top of these things, the plate isn't big enough. right, to sustain enough size, right? You really, in order to make these work, you need to be at about where we are at a minimum, 300 kW or larger, and not every
What does that
property.
mean in terms of arrays? I mean, what space are we talking about?
That's a good question, and I don't have that technical number off the top of my head. But many high-rise community buildings just don't have the square footage of a plate. We're using 4 different buildings on this in order to create enough room for that 273 kW. But when you look at some of these buildings, on top of them, a lot of the HVAC systems are sitting up there, their air conditioning units and others. They take up roof space and it minimizes it. And then you got to look at your shadows, whether that can work. And so you generally need not just a high-rise building. You need a more spread out surface. County garages could be an opportunity that we're looking at. But the good thing about the Housing Opportunities Commission was a sort of garden style property, had multiple buildings, so you could work within that sort of multiple footprint, as it were, to put the solar arrays.
So what other projects do you have in the pipeline?
Well, thanks for asking that. So one of our most recent products that we just put out there is called a commercial solar power purchase agreement product. And this is more akin to the sort of what one thinks about as a one-to-one relationship of a building owner and a solar array that's put on the building that generates power for the end user, being that property. We developed it with one segment in mind, in particular, nonprofits, faith-based institutions, because as we were out there working the market, we found many of them wanted to undertake solar for their properties. But one thing, they had too small a footprint. They might have been able to only do a 50 kW or 100 kW system. And many of the financing products out there just didn't work with that small a system. And the other was we wanted to solve a situation where they might not have the capital that they could expend in order to put a solar array up and then service that capital to get to the benefits. So the product that we put out there is a power purchase agreement in which they don't have to put anything out of pocket. A third-party developer comes in, finances it, builds it, owns it, operates it, and sells the solar-generated electricity coming off the solar array on their property to the organization. And we've developed it in a way that the organization sees some operating cost benefits by the price that we are able to offer them on a price per kilowatt hour from that solar array compared to what they would normally pay the utility for that generation.
You mean by year one?
Our intent is that we set it up so that from year one, you're at or below that number, but for the next 20 years, you don't see a change in that number. So that you have a constant operating cost, as it were, for that solar generated electricity.
Can I ask you whether you fund households and individuals in these kinds of projects?
Yeah, so we've got a homeowner product out there. We call it our Clean Energy Advantage. It provides both for energy efficiency improvements as well as for renewable energy improvements. So far, we've done 14 installations, renewable energy installations. 2 of them were geothermal, and 12 of them were solar PV installations. And so they really, what we try to do is bring a transparent financing product to the table. That we work with a private credit union as the lender on this. We stand behind them in terms of a credit risk, and we get a beneficial rate to it. But also, a lot of private capital can hide a few of the fees and so forth that come associated with it. We wanted to have a transparent product. We think it's helpful to the property owner to know what's really transpiring with the financing they're doing. And I think it's been successful. We partnered up with the county co-op last year, and that's where many of those loans came from. In that, as folks that participate in the co-op do so for a good reason. There's an economic benefit, but from participating in a co-op, it's sort of like a purchase benefit, right? So the solar installer brings as strong a price as possible. So that's one benefit. And then our financing, if that's not something that the homeowner wants to do out of pocket, they can choose our financing as a way to pay off the long-term debt on the project.
And typically, what rate of interest are you looking at in those things?
So I'm having to go back through it's so for the solar, it's a 4.49, 12. That's a 12 or 15 year rate. I think it's a 4.75 on a 20-year rate, I think.
Okay.
So
and geothermal is a different rate?
No, it's the same because they're both considered they're renewable and they're secured loans by the equipment. Yeah.
Are you working with any other county agencies right now? Trying to put renewables on their properties, and I'm really thinking about the biggest agency of all in the county, Montgomery County Public Schools. Are you in consultation with them? What are you talking about? What do you think you want?
Yeah, we've had several conversations with the Maryland Public School System, and we do know that they are looking, they've done solar RFPs in the past for their properties. We've been in connection and talking to them. I think they're, in the midst of thinking about whether they'll do another. We've been talking to them about that. And so we've had a number of different conversations with them on different fronts. And so, we talk with a lot of the county agencies. We talk with the Department of Housing and Community Affairs relative to things that they're doing, and with the affordable housing sector there. We've talked to the small business department there, and we've presented to a number of different working groups that they've had about our financing products to help small businesses. As they were reopening, we wanted them to be sure we even launched a product that was available if they needed to do improvements to improve their HVAC systems, to improve the indoor air quality in their properties. So we're very connected to many of the different departments, Department of Environmental Protection being one of the biggest connecting points for us.
Tom Deyo, thank you very much. Good luck. And I look forward to hearing about more projects.
Great, Sunil. Thank you for this opportunity. I know we've been waiting for the chance to get on board here and have this conversation. So glad we had it.
What you're thinking? Why do you always have to leave me here hanging off a cliff? I'm just so tired of trying to make...
What lessons can we draw from my conversations with Tom Deyo and Caitlynn Peetz? First, for as much as we complain about our government and government agencies, including our schools, we are actually better off than many, many others. The underlying question, perhaps to be asked by those not doing so well, is what is it about Montgomery County that makes it better? Income and education statistics show that Montgomery is one of the richest and most educated counties, not just in Maryland, but in the entire country. From wealth and education come public engagement and demand in politics that the government and political leaders must respond to. And yet there are two challenges. First, Montgomery County's wealth and education do not insulate it from national trends in political polarization, one reason why this show is called I Hate Politics. And perhaps even more importantly, high wealth and education hide inequalities that can be stark. It is interesting that white students constitute 15% of MCPS virtual academies, which are overrepresented by poorer and minority families. The complaint for equity should always pierce the self-satisfaction we feel at being better than others. Second, communication in government agencies is the go-to cause for government failure. Whether it is MCPS and its 209 schools, or whether we can put solar arrays on top of all county buildings, a key demand from climate activists now, making different parts of government work together has been an enduring problem in society. And yet, for being so intractable and enduring a problem, we do not take seriously the structural causes that lie behind communication failures, and we don't address them. MCPS has had 209 schools for a long time, and yet has not had the mechanisms for effective communication with those 209 schools. Surely it is time now to look under the hood. Specifically, it's time to look at the working arrangement between MCPS and the Department of Health and Human Services. As Caitlynn Peetz pointed out, it is not clear who should do what or who was supposed to do what. And when things don't go as planned, it is important to find out where the failure occurred, especially if you want to prevent it in the future. Third, the community solar project raises important questions about whether these projects would be possible without an interest rate subsidy or free roof rent. Or does it really matter, and that this is in fact the best use of public dollars? If indeed we need to make public subsidy to green our energy infrastructure, why are we investing so little and hoping that the market will fill the rest?
Why do you always have to leave me here hanging off a cliff? I'm just
That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics, and I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Sic Em Buster, a Washington area rock and metal band. The excerpts used in this episode are from their song I've Got Athlete's Foot and I'm Wearing Your Socks. You can find them on Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone who might, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.